Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In California, police have identified the gunman who killed 3 people, including 2 children, at a mass shooting Sunday at the Gilroy Garlic Festival as 19-year-old Santino William Ligon. He was fatally shot by police at the scene within minutes. Authorities say they're still determining a motive for the attack, but the gunman's social media activity shows him promoting a manifesto on white supremacy just moments before the rampage. He also wrote in a post Sunday, "Why overcrowd towns and pave more open space to make room for hordes of mestizos and Silicon Valley white expletives." Authorities say the gunman used an assault rifle that was purchased legally in Nevada. The AK-47 style weapon could not have been legally purchased in his home state of California because of stricter gun regulations. California Governor Gavin Newsom called the semi-automatic gun a weapon of mass destruction. 6-year-old Stephen Romero was the youngest victim of the shooting. Another child, 13-year-old Kayla Salazar, and 25-year-old student Trevor Irby also lost their lives in the massacre. Last week, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, testified before the Senate saying that domestic terrorism by white supremacists is on the rise. President Trump doubled down on his attacks against Congressmember and House Oversight Chair Elijah Cummings Monday, saying he was to blame for Baltimore's crime rates, and again lashing out over Cummings' questioning at his committee's hearing over the dire conditions for migrants at the U.S. border. This comes after Trump described Baltimore as a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess that no human being would want to live in. Trump also extended his attacks to civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton as he headed to Baltimore Monday, calling him a con man who hates whites and cops. Sharpton responded to Trump from Baltimore when he arrived.
I marched on him with Central Park 5. I dealt with him on the birther issue. He can say what he wants. Calls me a troublemaker. Yes, I make trouble for bigots. I made trouble for him with Central Park. I made trouble with him for birtherism. I'm going to keep making trouble for bigots. As far as me being a con man, if he really thought I was a con man, he'd be nominating me for his cabinet.
Maryland's Republican Governor Larry Hogan called Trump's attacks on Baltimore outrageous and inappropriate. Meanwhile, House Republicans are set to take their annual policy retreat in Baltimore in September. The Senate failed to override presidential vetoes on legislation that would have blocked arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Trump used an emergency declaration in May to push through the contested arms deal without congressional approval. Critics say the weapons could be used on civilians in Yemen. 6 Republicans voted in favor of overriding Trump's vetoes, which he issued last week. In Yemen, air raids on a market killed at least 10 people, including children, in the northern Sada province Monday, according to local reports. The attacks were carried out by U.S.-backed Saudi-led forces. The UN's Children in Armed Conflict report found the Saudi-led coalition was responsible for killing or wounding 729 Yemeni children in 2018. The opposition Houthi forces killed or wounded 398 children last year, according to the UN report. In Sudan, activists say at least 5 people were killed Monday after security forces fired on peaceful high school student demonstrators protesting military rule. The victims were between 15 and 17 years old. The killings are believed to have been carried out by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, who protesters say are behind the deadly raid on a protest camp in Khartoum last month that killed an estimated 130 people. Over the weekend, Sudan's Traditional Military Council said their investigation into the June 3rd raid found rogue military personnel were to blame for the deaths of just 87 protesters. Human rights groups and protesters on the ground say the government is deliberately undercounting the deaths. Physicians for Human Rights calls the government investigation biased and inadequate and says it reflects the urgent need for an impartial, independent international investigation. Representatives from the Military Council and the civilian coalition in Sudan are meeting today to discuss details of a power-sharing deal agreed to earlier this month. In Brazil, at least 57 people were killed in a prison gang riot Monday in the state of Pará. Authorities say 16 people were decapitated while others died of asphyxiation after a fire filled the prison with thick smoke. In May, at least 55 prisoners were killed when fights broke out across 4 prisons in the state of Amazonas. Brazil has the 3rd largest prison population in the world. Human rights groups say prisons are massively overcrowded and rife with mistreatment and violence. The Altamira jail, where Monday's riot took place, housed more than twice its capacity capacity of prisoners. President Jair Bolsonaro, who campaigned on a Law and Order platform, has said he would stuff prison cells with criminals. A new report by Global Witness found 164 people were killed in 2018 for trying to protect the environment. The Philippines ranks top of the list with 30 deaths, while in Guatemala the number of deaths jumped by more than 4 times. The number of recorded deaths also rose sharply in India. Global Witness says activists who are being targeted are defending land and resources that are being exploited for consumer-driven items such as cell phones and jewelry, as well as food. The highest increase in last year's numbers is attributed to killings of water defenders, which includes conflicts over hydropower in Guatemala. Indigenous groups are a particular risk of being targeted. Last week, tribal leader Amira Waipi was stabbed to death in Brazil by gold miners in the remote village of Amapá. We'll have more on what happened in Brazil with Carlos Ratil, Executive Secretary of Climate Observatory, later in the broadcast. You can also see our interview with Luis Roberto Murillo about activist murders in Colombia at democracynow.org. In Auckland, New Zealand, thousands of Indigenous people are protesting plans for a new housing development on sacred land. Fletcher Building, New Zealand's largest developer, plans to build nearly 500 homes in the Ihumatao. Land defenders have been protesting the move for years, and a group has been camping out on the proposed site for a week. This is Honi Harawira, a Maori activist and former member of the parliament who's been taking part in the mass protest.
Stop ignoring the people here. You can't just make it like this is not happening. You've got to bring the people to the table.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern on Friday said no construction would take place for now and promised talks with the Indigenous communities. The record-breaking heat wave that gripped Europe last week is now heading northwards, and scientists warn it could cause an unprecedented melt of Greenland's ice sheet. The UN said this month alone Greenland lost 160 billion tons of surface ice. If the ice sheet melts entirely, it would raise global sea levels by almost 23 feet. Last month was the hottest June ever recorded on Earth, while July is on track to be the hottest month ever. The second Democratic primary debates kick off tonight in Detroit. 20 candidates vying for the 2020 nomination will face off over 2 nights. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders will be among the 10 contenders facing off tonight. And more 2020 news, CNN and MSNBC both announced last week they would hold town halls centered on the climate crisis. This comes after a sustained campaign by climate activists to include a climate-focused debate as part of the primaries. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez has denied such demands, though the DNC is scheduled to vote on a resolution supporting the call next month. Activists celebrated the announcement by the networks, but say a climate debate, not just the town halls, are needed. For CNN's event, participants must meet the same eligibility requirements as the September debates, meaning they must meet certain polling and donation thresholds by August 28th. Ahead of the debates, California Senator Kamala Harris has released her health care proposal, which would allow individuals to buy into Medicare and slowly expand the system over 10 years. Her plan would keep private insurance in the marketplace, but require that those plans adhere to standards and costs set by Medicare. Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign quickly slammed Harris's plan, saying it's, quote, centered around privatizing Medicare, enriching insurance executives, and introducing more corporate greed and profiteering into the Medicare system. Sanders is calling for a single-payer health care system run by the government that would essentially do away with private insurers. Medicare for all. In more 2020 news, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary and San Antonio Mayor Julian Castros has introduced a plan to increase the political power and ensure the rights of Indigenous communities. Castros' proposal calls for improvements to housing, health care, economic status, education, and voting rights for Native groups. Castro evoked the struggles at Standing Rock and Mauna Kea in Hawaii on Twitter as he announced his plan and vowed to, quote, strengthen tribal sovereignty, honor treaty commitments, ensure justice for Indigenous women, and advance tribal federal partnerships for progress. Philadelphia's Hahnemann University Hospital released its last patient last week and is expected to fully shutter within the coming weeks, laying off over 2,500 union staff and leaving a vacuum in medical services for low-income people in the area. Philadelphia residents and activists have been battling the closure of the 171-year-old institution. They say the private equity executive Joel Friedman, whose firm Paladin Healthcare bought Hahnemann Hospital last year, is seeking to use bankruptcy proceedings to sell the property property for development as luxury condos and hotels. Senator Bernie Sanders, who rallied with local residents earlier this month, decried the culture of corporate greed responsible for the closure. Sanders said his Medicare for All plan would include a fund so local governments can purchase hospitals in financial distress. Capital One says a hacker exposed the personal data of its customers, including about 140,000 Social Security numbers and tens of thousands of bank account numbers. Tens of millions of credit card applications were also stolen. The FBI arrested Seattle software engineer Paige Thompson over the breach and charged her with computer fraud and abuse. Thompson's online activity led investigators to her as she allegedly boasted about the hack on social networking sites. Last week, credit bureau Equifax settled for at least $650 million over a 2017 data breach that affected the personal information of more than 147 million consumers, the largest such settlement for a data breach. President Trump signed a bill Monday to permanently fund the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, which provides health care for first responders to the 9/11 terror attacks. First responders have been lobbying for its passage for months. This is Trump speaking at the signing.
And I was down there also, but I'm not considering myself a first responder. But I was down there. I spent a lot of time down there with you.
According to a retired deputy chief from the New York Fire Department, he never saw Trump at Ground Zero. Quote, he said he was a private citizen at the time. I don't know what kind of role he could have possibly played. That was Richard Alice telling the New York Times. According to the 9/11 after the 9/11 attack, Trump boasted his building, 40 Wall Street, had become the tallest building in downtown Manhattan after the collapse of the World Trade Center. The claim was untrue. And volunteers in Ethiopia planted 350 million trees Monday as part of a national campaign to help tackle the global climate crisis. 80% of Ethiopia's population depends on agriculture for its livelihood, but Ethiopia suffers from soil erosion, deforestation, flooding, and harsh drought conditions. According to the organization Farm Africa, less than 4% of Ethiopia's land is forested, down from around 30% at the end of the 19th century. A study released earlier this year found planting 1.2 trillion trees could cancel out 10 years of carbon dioxide emissions. This is scientist Samuel Gilletta speaking about the initiative Monday.
The issue of the environment is of major concern, even at the global level, but more so for this country. Most of the problems and famine we see in this country could be linked to the lack of protection for our environment.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.